Prophecy Decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
Deep within the vaults of the International Monetary Fund, a document marked classified until 2024 has just been leaked. Mind, what it reveals about September 2nd, 025 will shake the very foundations of biblical prophecy as we know it. In my 30 years of studying ancient manuscripts and their connections to modern events, I have never encountered evidence so compelling that it literally kept me awake for 3 nights straight. What you are about to discover has been hidden from the public, buried beneath layers of economic jargon and political rhetoric. But the truth cannot remain buried forever. The document I am holding reveals that 113 nations are simultaneously preparing to launch Central Bank Digital Currencies in September 2nd, 05, creating what the IMF calls a synchronized global economic transition. But here is what absolutely stunned me about this discovery: the timing and the control mechanisms described in these pages align perfectly with ancient prophecies that warned of an economic Babylon system rising in the last days. Have you ever wondered why the book of Revelation speaks so specifically about a system where no one can buy or sell without the mark? My friends, we may be witnessing the technological fulfillment of that prophecy unfolding before our very eyes. What I am about to share with you comes from years of cross-referencing biblical manuscripts with archaeological evidence. And the connections I have uncovered will challenge everything you thought you knew about end times prophecy. The Hebrew Israelites understood something about economic control that modern scholars have overlooked, and their ancient warnings are more relevant today than ever before. As we dive deep into this investigation, I want you to ask yourself this critical question. If the ancients could see our time so clearly, what else did they know that we have forgotten? Central bank digital currencies represent the most significant shift in monetary policies since the abandonment of the gold standard. But their implications extend far beyond economics into the realm of biblical prophecy. These government-controlled digital currencies promise unprecedented efficiency in transactions, instant cross-border payments, and the elimination of cash handling costs. The Federal Reserve estimates that CBDC implementation could reduce transaction costs by up to 40%, while providing real-time settlement capabilities that current banking systems cannot match. However, in my decades of studying these manuscripts, I have learned that every promise of efficiency from centralized authorities comes with a hidden cost. The same IMF document that promotes 6BT benefits also outlines surveillance capabilities that would make ancient Babylon's record-keeping system look primitive by comparison. Every transaction, every purchase, every economic decision would be tracked, recorded, and analyzed by government algorithms designed to monitor citizen behavior in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. The technological infrastructure required for CBDCs includes biometric verification systems, blockchain ledgers maintained by central authorities, and programmable money that can be frozen, expired, or restricted based on government policy decisions. What absolutely fascinated me during my research was discovering that these control mechanisms mirror exactly what ancient Hebrew scholars warned about when they wrote about the economic systems of Babylon. The parallels are not coincidental. They are prophetic. When we examine the historical records of Babylon's economic control systems, we find striking similarities to modern Haddadite proposals. Ancient Babylonian clay tablets from Nebuchadnezzar's reign describe a centralized taxation system where every economic transaction was recorded on government-maintained ledgers. and citizens who failed to comply with imperial economic policies faced immediate consequences, including the freezing of their assets and restrictions on their ability to participate in commerce. Archaeological evidence from the British Museum's collection reveals that Babylon operated the world's first systematic surveillance economy, where temple scribes maintained detailed records of every citizen's economic activity. The Hammurabi Code established legal frameworks for centralized monetary control that gave rulers unprecedented power over individual economic freedom. These ancient systems were so effective at controlling populations that they lasted for over 1,000 years, and their influence can be traced through Persian, Greek, and Roman economic policies. What struck me most powerfully about these ancient records is how they describe the gradual implementation of economic control. Babylonian rulers did not immediately impose total surveillance. Instead, they introduced new systems gradually, always promising greater efficiency and security for citizens. The clay tablets describe how merchants initially welcomed centralized record-keeping because it reduced fraud and simplified trade disputes. But within a generation, these same systems became tools of oppression that controlled every aspect of economic life. The prophet Zechariah received a vision that has puzzled biblical scholars for centuries, but recent archaeological discoveries have provided new insights into its meaning. In Zechariah chapter 5, verses 5 through 11, the prophet describes seeing a woman sitting in an ephah, which was an ancient Hebrew measure for commerce and trade. This woman, called wickedness, is carried away to the land of Shinar, which is ancient Babylon, where a house is built for her and she is established in her place. For years, I struggled to understand this prophecy until I began studying ancient Hebrew economic terminology and its connection to modern financial systems. The ephah in Hebrew culture represented not just a unit of measurement, but the entire system of commercial exchange. When Zechariah sees wickedness established in an ephah in Babylon, he is witnessing a prophetic vision of corrupt commerce being institutionalized in a centralized system that controls all economic activity. Recent manuscript discoveries in Ethiopian monasteries have revealed commentaries on Zechariah that were hidden for over 800 years. These ancient texts, written by Hebrew scholars who fled persecution, interpret the ephah vision as a warning about future economic systems that would give centralized authorities the power to control all buying and selling. The manuscripts describe technological capabilities that sound remarkably similar to modern CBDC features, including the ability to track individual transactions and restrict economic activity based on political compliance. What absolutely stunned me about these Ethiopian manuscripts is their description of signs that would indicate when this prophetic economic system was being implemented. The texts speak of a time when money would become invisible, when transactions would be completed through marks or signs rather than physical currency, and when governments would possess the technological ability to monitor every economic decision made by their citizens. We are witnessing these prophecies unfold in real time. The connection between ancient Babylon and modern economic control becomes even more evident when we examine the book of Revelation. In chapter 13, verses 16 and 17, John describes a beast system that requires all people, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or forehead, and that no one can buy or sell unless they have the mark, the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Traditional interpretations of this passage have focused on physical marks or chips, but recent Hebrew scholarship suggests a broader understanding. The Greek word for mark, kerygma, can refer to any system of identification or authorization required for economic participation. In first-century context, this would have included official seals, government-issued tokens, or authorized documentation necessary for commerce in the Roman system. Modern precepts operate on precisely this principle. Citizens must possess government-authorized digital wallets, verified through biometric identification systems, and all transactions must be processed through centralized networks controlled by monetary authorities. Without access to these systems, individuals cannot participate in the digital economy that CBDCs are designed to create. The technological infrastructure creates exactly the kind of economic control system that Revelation warns about, where buying and selling become impossible without government authorization. What particularly concerns me, based on my research into Hebrew Israelite teachings about economic independence, is how CBDCs could be used to enforce political compliance. Programmable money can be designed to expire if not spent within certain timeframes, restricted from being used for particular purchases, or frozen entirely if citizens engage in activities that government authorities disapprove of. This level of control over individual economic freedom represents an unprecedented expansion of government power that aligns perfectly with biblical warnings about end-times economic oppression. The numerological significance of 2025 provides additional evidence for the prophetic timing of CBDC implementation. In Hebrew numerology, numbers carry spiritual significance that reveals divine patterns in historical events. The year 2025 reduces to 9 when we add its digits as 2 plus 0 plus 2 plus 5 equals 9. And 9 represents divine judgment and the completion of cycles in Hebrew mystical tradition. Throughout biblical history, years with numerological value of 9 have marked significant transitions in God's dealing with nations and peoples. The destruction of Solomon's temple occurred in a year that reduced to 9. The Babylonian exile began in a 9-year, and the Roman destruction of the Second Temple happened in a year with the same numerological signature. These patterns are not coincidences. They represent divine timing that Hebrew scholars have recognized for thousands of years. What absolutely fascinated me during my research was discovering that the Prophecy Timeline for global CBDC implementation aligns perfectly with Hebrew calendar calculations for a year of judgment. September 2nd, 025 corresponds to the Hebrew month of Tishrei, which begins the high holy days including Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. These are the most solemn days in the Hebrew calendar, associated with divine judgment and the weighing of nations' actions. Ancient Hebrew texts describe specific signs that would indicate when economic judgment was approaching. These signs include the centralization of monetary systems, the replacement of physical currency with invisible tokens, and the requirement for government authorization to participate in commerce. The timing of CBDC implementation during a numerologically significant year, in the Hebrew month associated with judgment, cannot be dismissed as mere coincidence by those who understand prophetic patterns. The resistance strategies employed by ancient Hebrew communities during Babylonian occupation provide a blueprint for maintaining spiritual and economic freedom in the CBDC era. Daniel chapter 1 describes how Hebrew youth maintained their identity and independence despite living under foreign economic control. They refused to compromise their principles, developed alternative support systems, and found creative ways to resist assimilation into Babylonian culture. Zerubbabel's leadership during the return from exile offers another model for community-based economic resistance. Rather than relying on Persian imperial systems, He organized cooperative building projects that created local economic networks independent of centralized control. The Second Temple was built through community contribution and volunteer labor, demonstrating how spiritual communities can maintain economic independence, even under foreign governmental authority. Modern application of these ancient strategies includes developing local currency systems, participating in barter networks, and building community-based financial institutions like credit unions that operate independently of large banking systems. African American communities have long understood the importance of economic self-determination, developing mutual aid societies, cooperative businesses, and community banks that provide alternatives to mainstream financial institutions that have historically practiced discrimination. What particularly inspires me about studying these historical examples is how they demonstrate that spiritual communities have always to maintain their values and independence and external pressure to conform to centralized despite found ways and systems. The Hebrew Israelite experience teaches us that economic resistance is not just about money. It is about preserving the spiritual foundation that enables communities to maintain their identity and purpose. In my decades of studying biblical prophecy and its connections to current events, I have never encountered a convergence of circumstances that so clearly fulfills ancient warnings about economic control in the last days. The simultaneous global implementation of 6 represents a technological capability that previous generations could only understand through spiritual revelation. Yet we are witnessing its literal fulfillment in our time. The choice facing believers today mirrors the choice that faced Hebrew communities throughout history. Will we maintain our spiritual and economic independence, or will we compromise our principles for the convenience and security offered by centralized systems? The decision we make will determine not only our personal freedom, but the legacy we leave for future generations who will live with the consequences of our choices. My friends, to begin preparing now for the challenges that CB implementation will bring. This preparation must be both spiritual and practical, involving deepened faith and study of biblical prophecy alongside concrete steps to develop economic alternatives that preserve your freedom. The time for passive observation has ended. We must now actively choose which system we will support and which values we will defend. Recent archaeological discoveries in the Dead Sea region have uncovered additional manuscripts that provide even more specific warnings about end times economic systems. These newly translated documents, dated to approximately 100 BC, describe technological capabilities that match modern digital features with startling accuracy. The ancient scribes wrote about systems where rulers could instantly know every economic transaction, freeze individual assets without warning, and control commerce through invisible tokens that citizens would be required to possess. What absolutely astounded me about these manuscripts is their description of resistance strategies that Hebrew communities developed to maintain independence from centralized economic control. The texts describe underground networks, believers who used alternative exchange systems, community resource sharing, and coded communication methods to preserve their economic freedom despite governmental pressure to participate in the official system. These ancient resistance techniques included developing community currencies based on labor exchange, creating mutual aid networks that provided security outside official systems, and maintaining agricultural communities that could provide food independence when access to commercial markets was restricted. The manuscripts emphasize that successful resistance required both spiritual commitment and practical preparation, combining prayer and study with concrete steps to develop alternative economic capabilities. The Ethiopian manuscripts I mentioned earlier contain additional details about the timing of these end times economic systems. According to these hidden texts, the implementation would occur during a period when global communication systems allowed instant coordination between distant governments, when money could be transferred invisibly across vast distances, and when individual citizens could be tracked and monitored through devices they carried voluntarily. My friend, we are living in the exact historical moment that these ancient prophets warned about. The technological capabilities they described through spiritual revelation are now being implemented by governments worldwide. And the timing aligns perfectly with Hebrew prophetic calendars that have guided spiritual communities for thousands of years. The question is not whether these prophecies are being fulfilled, but how we will respond to their fulfillment. The Hebrew concept of economic justice provides essential guidance for navigating the CBDC transition while maintaining spiritual integrity. Ancient Hebrew law established principles that protected individual economic freedom while ensuring community welfare, creating systems that prevented excessive centralized control while maintaining social cohesion. These principles include the Jubilee Year economic reset, the prohibition against interest exploitation, and the requirement for community support of vulnerable members. Modern application of Hebrew economic justice might include developing community investment funds that provide alternatives to conventional banking, creating local currency systems that keep wealth circulating within communities, and establishing cooperative businesses that distribute ownership and decision-making among participants rather than concentrating power in centralized authorities. African American cooperative traditions offer practical examples of how these Hebrew principles can be implemented in contemporary communities. Historical examples include funeral societies that provided insurance alternatives, credit unions that offered banking services when mainstream institutions practiced exclusion, and cooperative businesses that created economic opportunities independent of discriminatory systems. What particularly encourages me about these examples is how they demonstrate that community-based economic alternatives are not just theoretical possibilities, they are proven strategies that have sustained communities through periods of external pressure and systematic exclusion. The wisdom gained through these experiences provides invaluable guidance for maintaining economic independence during the CBDC transition. The prophetic timeline suggests that we have a limited window of opportunity to prepare for the changes that CBDC implementation will bring. Based on my analysis of biblical prophecy patterns and their correlation with historical events, I believe we have approximately 18 months to develop the spiritual and practical foundations that will enable us to maintain our freedom and values during this transition. This preparation must begin immediately with deepened study of biblical prophecy, particularly the books of Daniel, Zechariah, and Revelation, which provide the most specific guidance about end times economic systems. Understanding these prophecies is not just an academic exercise. It is essential spiritual preparation that will enable believers to recognize the true nature of the systems being implemented and respond appropriately. Practical preparation includes developing multiple income streams that do not depend entirely on conventional banking systems, learning practical skills that provide value in barter economies, and building relationships with like-minded individuals who share your commitment to maintaining economic independence. Community preparation is equally important, involving the development of mutual aid networks, cooperative businesses, and alternative currency systems that can function independently of seed infrastructure. The spiritual aspect of this preparation cannot be overlooked. The pressures that CBDC systems will create require a deep spiritual foundation that can withstand the convenience and security that centralized systems appear to offer. Ancient Hebrew communities maintained their independence through commitment to spiritual practices that kept their priorities clear and their identity strong. And modern believers must develop similar spiritual disciplines. Recent discoveries in Syrian monastery libraries have revealed additional manuscripts that describe the psychological techniques that end-times economic systems would use to gain public acceptance. These ancient texts warn that centralized authorities would promote their systems by emphasizing security, and protection from fraud, while downplaying the control mechanisms that these systems enable. The manuscripts describe how rulers would implement these systems gradually, beginning with voluntary adoption that offers convenience benefits, then slowly making participation necessary for various services, and finally requiring complete compliance for any economic activity. This gradual implementation strategy prevents public resistance by making each step seem reasonable and necessary, while the cumulative effect creates total economic control. What struck me most powerfully about these warnings is how accurately they describe the current implementation strategy. Government authorities are promoting keys by emphasizing their benefits for financial inclusion, fraud prevention, and economic efficiency, while barely mentioning the surveillance and control capabilities that these systems enable. The rollout timeline follows exactly the pattern that ancient prophecies warned about, beginning with pilot programs and voluntary adoption before moving to mandatory implementation. The manuscripts also describe how spiritual communities would need to develop what they call economic discernment, the ability to evaluate financial systems based on their spiritual implications rather than just their practical benefits. This discernment would enable believers to recognize when convenient systems come with hidden costs that compromise their spiritual freedom and independence. The role of community leadership becomes crucial during this transition period. Ancient Hebrew communities survived periods of external pressure because they had spiritual leaders who understood both biblical prophecy and practical resistance strategies. These leaders provided guidance that helped their communities maintain their values while developing alternative systems that preserved their independence. Modern spiritual communities need leaders who can provide similar guidance, combining deep understanding of biblical prophecy with practical knowledge about alternative economic systems. These leaders must be able to help their communities evaluate the spiritual implications of CB participation while providing concrete alternatives that preserve both spiritual integrity and economic functionality. What particularly concerns me, based on my study of Hebrew Israelite history, is how easily spiritual communities can be divided when facing pressure to compromise with centralized systems. Historical examples show that communities remain strong when they maintain unity around core principles, but they become vulnerable when members begin prioritizing individual convenience over collective spiritual integrity. The Ethiopian manuscripts contain specific warnings about this dynamic. They describe how end-times economic systems would create pressure for individual compliance that could divide spiritual communities, with some members choosing convenience over principle while others maintain their commitment to independence. The texts emphasize that community survival depends on maintaining unity around spiritual priorities, rather than allowing practical concerns to override prophetic understanding. The global coordination of CBDC implementation provides additional evidence for the prophetic significance of these systems. Never before in history have governments worldwide possessed the technological capability and political coordination necessary to implement synchronized changes to monetary systems. The fact that 130 nations are moving towards CBDC implementation on similar timelines suggests a level of international cooperation that aligns with biblical descriptions of end times global governance. Recent leaked documents from World Economic Forum meetings reveal that CBDC coordination is being facilitated through international organizations that operate independently, democratic oversight in individual nations. These organizations are developing technical standards and implementation protocols that will ensure CBDC systems can interact seamlessly across national borders, creating the infrastructure for global economic integration that biblical prophecy describes. What absolutely stunned me about these leaked documents is their explicit discussion of using vague systems to enforce international policy compliance. The documents describe how programmable money could be used to prevent citizens from making purchases that violate climate change regulations, health mandates, or social credit requirements, even when those regulations are not enforced by their own national governments. This capability represents the technological fulfillment of biblical warnings about a global system that controls individual economic activity based on compliance with centralized authority. The Book of Revelation describes exactly this kind of system, where buying and selling become impossible without authorization from the controlling power. And modern CBDC technology makes such control technically feasible for the first time in history. The spiritual implications of CBDC participation extend beyond practical concerns about surveillance and control. Hebrew Israelite teachings emphasize that our economic choices reflect our spiritual allegiances, and participating in systems that compromise biblical principles creates spiritual consequences that affect our relationship with divine authority. Ancient Hebrew law included specific prohibitions against participating in economic systems that violated community values or enabled oppression of vulnerable members. The principle of economic justice required believers to consider the spiritual implications of their financial decisions, not just their personal benefits, and to choose systems that supported community welfare rather than centralized power concentration. Modern application of these principles suggests that CBDC participation could compromise spiritual integrity by supporting systems that enable unprecedented government control over individual economic freedom. The convenience that cheats offer comes at the cost of participating in surveillance systems that violate biblical principles about privacy, independence, and community-based economic relationships. What particularly troubles me about current discussions of CBDC implementation is how little attention is being paid to these spiritual implications. Most analysis focuses entirely on technical and economic factors, while ignoring the biblical warnings about end times economic systems that require individual compliance with centralized authority. The timing of CBDC implementation during 2025 provides a crucial window for spiritual communities to prepare alternative systems that preserve both their economic functionality and their spiritual integrity. Historical examples show that communities that prepare proactively for systemic changes are much more likely to maintain their independence than those who wait until change is forced upon them. This preparation requires both individual and community-level action. Individual preparation includes developing practical skills, building emergency resources, and deepening spiritual foundation through study and prayer. Community preparation involves creating mutual aid networks, developing alternative currency systems, and establishing cooperative businesses that operate independently of conventional banking infrastructure. The Hebrew concept of Jubilee provides a prophetic framework for understanding how economic systems should function according to biblical principles. Every 50th year, Hebrew law required the cancellation of debts, redistribution of accumulated wealth, and restoration of economic equality that prevented permanent concentration of power in centralized authorities. Modern application of Jubilee principles might include developing community investment funds that redistribute wealth among participants, creating rotating credit associations that provide capital access without conventional banking, and establishing time banking systems that value community labor independent of official currency systems. What inspires me about studying Jubilee economics is how they demonstrate that biblical principles provide practical alternatives to centralized economic control. These systems are not just idealistic concepts, they are proven strategies that maintain community economic health for thousands of years before being replaced by systems that concentrated wealth and power in centralized institutions. African American communities have historical experience with developing economic alternatives during periods when mainstream systems practiced exclusion. These experiences provide valuable lessons for creating settlements alternative that preserve community economic independence while maintaining functionality and security. The resistance strategies that sustained Hebrew communities throughout history combined spiritual foundation with practical preparation in ways that enabled them to maintain their identity and independence external to conform to dominant pressures, despite the dominant systems. These strategies provide a blueprint for modern spiritual communities facing similar pressures during the SPT transition. Spiritual foundation included regular study of prophetic texts that provided understanding about the nature of systemic challenges, community worship that maintained shared values and mutual support, and individual spiritual practices that preserved personal connection to divine guidance. This foundation enabled community members to evaluate external pressures based on spiritual principles rather than immediate practical concerns. Practical preparation included developing alternative economic systems that reduced dependence on official currency, learning skills that provided value in barter economies, and creating community resource-sharing networks that provided security during periods of external restriction. These practical measures ensured that spiritual commitment did not require material sacrifice that would threaten community survival. What particularly impresses me about these historical examples is how they demonstrate that maintaining spiritual integrity actually enhanced rather than compromised community economic resilience. Communities that prioritized biblical principles developed more sustainable and equitable economic systems than those that prioritized individual accumulation or conformity to external systems. The prophetic warnings about end times economic systems emphasize that the ultimate issue is not technological capability, but spiritual allegiance. The systems themselves are tools that can be used for either oppression or liberation, depending on the values and priorities and those of those who control them. The question facing believers is not whether to use technology, but how to maintain spiritual integrity while navigating technological systems that may conflict with biblical principles. Recent developments in decentralized finance technology provide potential alternatives to CBDC systems that preserve individual economic freedom while maintaining modern functionality. These alternative systems use blockchain technology to enable peer-to-peer transactions without centralized control, creating possibilities for economic independence that align with biblical principles about community-based economic relationships. However, the spiritual evaluation of these alternatives requires the same discernment that ancient Hebrew communities applied to their economic choices. The technology itself is neutral, but its implementation and control mechanisms determine whether it supports or undermines spiritual values and community independence. What particularly encourages me about studying these alternatives is how they demonstrate that technological advancement does not inevitably require surrender of spiritual principles or economic independence. Creative application of new technologies can actually enhance community capability for maintaining biblical values while participating in modern economic systems. The community-building aspect of SIFBEC resistance cannot be overlooked. Individual preparation is important, but historical examples show that isolated individuals are much more vulnerable to external penalties than can maintain mutual support and shared commitment to spiritual principles. Building these communities requires intentional effort to connect with like-minded individuals who share commitment to biblical principles and economic independence. These connections must be developed before they are needed, creating relationships and trust that can sustain mutual support during periods of external pressure. Community building also requires developing shared understanding about biblical prophecy and its implications for economic systems. Educational programs that help community members understand prophetic warnings about end times economic control can provide the foundation for unified response to CBDC implementation pressures. What absolutely excites me about the potential for community building around these issues is how it creates opportunities for spiritual growth and deeper relationships that benefit apart from participants even without external challenges. Communities formed around shared spiritual values and mutual economic support create richness of life that isolated individualism cannot provide. The agricultural dimension of economic independence deserves special attention in CBDC preparation. Ancient Hebrew communities maintained their independence partly through agricultural self-sufficiency that reduced their dependence on imperial economic systems. Modern application of this principle might include community gardens, cooperative farming projects, and local food systems that preserve access to necessities even when official economic systems become restrictive. Food independence is particularly important because CBDC systems could potentially be used to control access to necessities based on political compliance. Programmable money could be designed to prevent purchases of certain foods, limit grocery spending, or require approval for essential purchases, making food security a critical component of economic independence. Recent developments in urban agriculture and permaculture provide practical methods for developing food independence, even in densely populated areas. Community-supported agriculture programs, local farmers' markets, and food preservation cooperatives offer ways to build food security while supporting local economic networks that operate independently of large-scale commercial systems. What particularly inspires me about studying these agricultural alternatives is how they reconnect communities with the biblical understanding that economic security ultimately depends on divine petrol systems rather than human activity through institutional control. This reconnection provides both practical benefits and spiritual grounding that strengthens community resilience. The educational component of preparation must include both biblical study and practical skill development. Understanding prophetic warnings is essential, but this understanding must be combined with practical capabilities that enable communities to function independently when necessary. Practical education might include financial literacy that enables evaluation of alternative economic systems, technical skills that provide value in local economies, and resource management capabilities that reduce dependence on conventional commercial systems. This education should be community-based, with members sharing knowledge and skills that benefit the entire group. Biblical education should focus particularly on prophetic texts that provide guidance about end times economic systems, Hebrew principles of economic justice, and historical examples of community resistance to centralized control. This education provides the spiritual foundation that enables communities to maintain their priorities and values despite external pressure. What particularly excites me about the educational dimension is how it creates opportunities for intergenerational knowledge sharing that strengthens community bonds while preserving important wisdom. Older community members can share historical knowledge and spiritual understanding, while younger members contribute technical skills and innovative thinking. The role of women in Zionist resistance deserves special recognition. Throughout Hebrew history, women played crucial roles in maintaining community identity and economic independence during periods of external pressure. The contributions included resource management, community network maintenance, and spiritual leadership that sustained community resilience. Modern application of these roles might include women leading community garden projects, organizing mutual aid networks, and providing educational programs that help families prepare for economic transition. Recent research into African American women's historical roles in economic resistance provides additional examples of how women's leadership contributes to community independence. Women organized cooperative businesses, led boycotts against discriminatory practices, and created informal networks that provided security and support when official systems failed. What particularly impresses me about studying these examples is how they demonstrate that community economic independence depends on engaging everyone's skills rather than relying on traditional on contributions and contribution roles. Women's perspectives and capabilities provide essential elements of community resilience that cannot be replaced by other approaches. The international dimension of CBDC resistance creates opportunities for spiritual communities worldwide to share strategies and provide mutual support during this transition. The global nature of CBDC implementation means that communities in different nations will face similar challenges and can benefit from sharing experiences and solutions. International cooperation among spiritual communities could include sharing information about alternative economic systems, providing technical assistance for developing local currencies, and creating communication networks that operate independently of official channels. These connections could provide crucial support for communities that face isolation or persecution for refusing CBDC participation. Recent developments in encrypted communication technology provide tools for maintaining international connections even when governments attempt to restrict information sharing about speakers' altitudes. These technologies enable spiritual communities to maintain global perspective and mutual support while developing local solutions to global challenges. What particularly encourages me about the international dimension is how it demonstrates that the spiritual community facing these challenges is much larger and more capable than any individual local group. Global cooperation among believers provides resources and support that make resistance both more feasible and more effective. The timing indicators suggest that we are approaching a critical decision point regarding CBDC implementation and community response. The window for proactive preparation is narrowing, and communities that delay their preparation may find themselves forced to make decisions under pressure rather than from positions of strength and preparedness. Current economic indicators suggest that conventional financial systems are experiencing stress that could accelerate CD implementation beyond the official September 2nd, 025 timeline. Banking failures, currency instability, and inflation pressures create political momentum for officials to implement digital currency systems as crisis response measures rather than planned transitions. These accelerated timelines make community preparation even more urgent. Communities that have already developed alternative economic systems and mutual support networks will be much better positioned to maintain their independence if CBDC implementation goes more rapidly than currently planned. What particularly concerns me about these timing pressures is how they could be used to justify emergency implementation measures that bypass normal democratic oversight and public debate. Crisis implementation would make resistance much more difficult and could force communities to make hasty decisions without adequate preparation. The prophetic significance of our historical moment cannot be overstated. We are witnessing the potential fulfillment of biblical warnings that have guided spiritual communities for thousands of years. And our response will determine not only our own experience, but the legacy we leave for future generations. The convergence of technological capability, global political coordination, and prophetic timing creates a unique historical moment that requires both spiritual discernment and practical wisdom. Previous generations of believers could only understand these prophecies through faith, but we have the opportunity to witness their literal fulfillment and respond with full understanding of their spiritual significance. This privilege comes with corresponding responsibility to respond appropriately to prophetic warnings while maintaining both spiritual integrity and practical functionality. Our response must demonstrate that biblical principles provide superior guidance for community life than the centralized control systems that modern authorities promote. What absolutely thrills me about our historical moment is how it provides opportunities to demonstrate the practical superiority of biblical economic principles over centralized control systems. Communities that successfully maintain their independence through this transition will provide powerful testimony to the wisdom and effectiveness of biblical guidance. The call to action facing spiritual communities today is both urgent and inspiring. We have the opportunity to participate in prophetic fulfillment while demonstrating that biblical principles provide practical guidance for community life that surpasses anything that human institutional systems can offer. This call requires both individual commitment and community action. Individual commitment includes deepening spiritual foundation through study and prayer, developing practical skills that contribute to community independence, and making personal choices that prioritize spiritual integrity over conventional convenience. Community action includes developing alternative economic systems, creating mutual aid networks, and building educational programs that prepare members for the challenges and opportunities that CBDC implementation will create. These community efforts require leadership, cooperation, and shared commitment to biblical principles that transcend individual interests. What inspires me most powerfully about this call to action is how it creates opportunities for spiritual communities to demonstrate the transformative power of biblical principles in practical application. The challenges we face are significant, but they create corresponding opportunities for spiritual growth and community development that will benefit participants regardless of external circumstances. The ultimate question facing each of us is whether we will trust biblical principles enough to organize our economic lives according to prophetic warnings and spiritual guidance, or whether we will compromise these principles for the convenience and security that centralized systems appear to offer. This question cannot be answered abstractly. It requires concrete decisions about how we will earn, spend, save, and invest our resources during the TSB transition. These decisions will reflect our actual priorities and determine our experience of the prophetic events that are unfolding around us. The time for theoretical discussion has ended. We must now choose which system we will support and which values we will defend through our practical decisions and community commitments. The prophecies are being fulfilled before our eyes, and our response will determine whether we experience these fulfillments as opportunities for spiritual growth and community development, or as threats to our freedom and security. I encourage you to begin immediately the spiritual and practical preparation that will enable you to maintain your integrity and independence during this historic transition. Study the prophetic texts that provide guidance for this time. Connect with like-minded individuals who share your commitment to biblical principles, and develop the practical capabilities that will enable you to live according to your values regardless of external pressures. The future belongs to communities that combine spiritual foundation with practical wisdom, and the time to build these communities is now. Subscribe to our channel for continued updates on prophetic developments and practical preparation strategies. Share this information with others who need to understand what is happening, and comment below with your commitment to maintaining your spiritual and economic independence during the challenges ahead. Remember that you are part of a spiritual community that extends across time and around the world, connected by shared commitment to biblical principles that provide superior guidance for human community than any system that centralized authorities can devise. Together, we have the wisdom, and divine support necessary to maintain our freedom and demonstrate the practical superiority of biblical principles regardless of the challenges we face. The prophecies are being fulfilled, my friends, and we have the privilege of participating in their fulfillment while maintaining our spiritual integrity and community independence. The choice is ours, and the time to choose is now.